Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia with Elaine Maag, who is a Principal Research Associate in the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she studies income support programs for low-income families and children. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, one of the key issues that we've been following on this show is the child tax credit, and you are the expert in that, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as a lot of people are concerned. So can you walk us through a little bit of the history of the child tax credit and really what it means?
Sure. The child tax credit was actually a program started under President Clinton. It was a $400 credit that quickly increased to $500, and it was a middle income parent program. It was really targeted to low income families didn't get it, and neither did high income families. But then it was doubled eventually under the Bush tax cuts. And that's when low income families started to get it. They didn't get the full amount of the credit, but they began receiving some credit. But then there was this sort of revolutionary change in 2021. The credit became much larger. So it went from a $2,000 credit to a $3,000 credit for children ages 6 to 17 and $3,600 per year for children under 6. The revolutionary pieces were twofold. The first is that it was the first time very low income families received the full benefit of the credit. Prior to that, there were about 27 million children living in families that didn't get the full credit just because their parents didn't earn enough. Second thing that was revolutionary is what many of your viewers will have noticed is that it started being delivered as a monthly credit. So from July to December, families got a monthly payment, and then they'll pick up the second half of their credit when they file their tax return in 2021.
And why is this a tax credit and not some other form of assistance?
So during the pandemic, legislators needed to act quickly. And so they drew on a program that already existed. We don't have a program in this country that covers every child or every person. The child tax credit was already covering about 90% of families. It needed to pick up those very low income children and up their credits to the maximum. But for the most part, the IRS had the information to be able to find most children. They certainly started from the largest base of information of any other agency. We also have had an issue in our country where we've sort of moved assistance from typical transfer programs, like you might have grown up with welfare, food stamps used to be bigger, and those programs have moved into the tax system. And so now the tax system actually has the largest anti-poverty program for families with children in the United States. It's the child tax credit and also the earned income tax credit. So legislators have favored tax cuts as opposed to spending program increases.
So prior to its expansion, what kind of impact was this credit having for low-income parents, children, and families?
So very low-income families, if you had no earnings in your household, you received no credit. The credit was structured such that you needed to have at least $2,500 of earnings. And after that, the credit would begin to phase in. For every additional dollar you earned, you got 15 cents. But there was a rule that said you could only receive a tax refund worth $1,400 per child. And that meant that high income children were getting $2,000 per child, and low income children were getting up to $1,400 per child. It was still an important program, though, for families with children. It provided substantial assistance to middle income families, and those moderate earning families, so not the very lowest income families with children, but still pretty low earners, were getting many benefits from the credits. In total, almost everyone was receiving a child tax credit except for sort of that extraordinarily, maybe top 5 or 10% of families with children. So it was a big poverty fighting tool. It was a big assistance for middle income families. And so it was still an important program. It just was missing those very low income children.
And maybe there hasn't been enough time to really study this yet, but are there any maybe preliminary ideas as to what this expanded program has been able to do over the last few months, 6 months up till now?
So it's true we don't know the long-term impacts yet, but we actually have had some remarkable research going on. The Census Bureau has been incredible about putting out data. And immediately after the first payments dropped in July, we saw food insecurity among families with children drop almost in half. So that's a big change for low-income families. We know that being in poverty is also a big indicator of, how well your child's going to do. When you're in poverty, if you're very young, your brain develops at a slower rate than higher earning families. When you are in early elementary school, you're more likely to not do well. You're less likely to graduate from high school. You're less likely to get a high paying job. You're more likely to interact with the criminal justice system, and you're more likely to interact with the welfare system later in life. So there's sort of this lifetime of negative effects from being in poverty. Columbia University did some really remarkable research that showed that these payments reduced poverty by something like 40% among families with children. So we saw this immediate boost in this concrete measure, food insecurity, but we also saw, the level of poverty drop dramatically, which we believe will have some long-term impacts for these families.
A 40% drop in poverty and a 50% drop in child hunger.
Right.
That's unbelievable.
Right. Those are extraordinary achievements, and they were done quite quickly in a program that, was mostly developed but needed some tweaks to really make it powerful.
And during a pandemic, when we've had these economic declines, that's really astounding. And coming at it from where we're in Philadelphia, the poorest big city in America. And one of the goals of our show has been to talk about issues like the child tax credit, earned income tax credit, make sure people know about this, so that it can be useful. And in Philadelphia, anything like this is doubly important from our point of view. Now, we've heard all these good things, but there's still concern that this may not continue. So this is part of President Biden's Build Back Better bill to make these payments permanent. We are seeing opposition. So I know we don't have a crystal ball here, but how likely is it that this can continue, will continue, or continue in some form?
So the child tax credit will live on for a long time, but in this form, it's totally uncertain. So it was a temporary expansion. It was just designed for 2021. Some folks voted for that expansion because of the extraordinary moment we were in with the pandemic. But what I like to remind people is child poverty was a problem before the pandemic. It was a problem during the pandemic that became, larger, and we were more aware of it. And it will continue to be a problem afterwards. So the need for the program to benefit those very low-income children will continue on for a long time. The child credit has undergone a series of expansions starting, way back in '97. And every time we've temporarily expanded it to assist more families, larger benefits, or lower income families, those expansions have stuck. So it would be quite a reversal for this expansion to be taken away. And we know if it's taken away, we will likely see food insecurity rise back up. We will see more housing insecurity. We will see families less ready to pay off bills. And all these positive benefits we've seen, we expect will slip away from us. It also will undercut the investment we made last year by not allowing that investment to go forward.
It sounds like we're going to see a lot of issues if this is not allowed to continue. I was very interested to read a report that you co-authored with Sam Hammond entitled Issues in Child Benefit Administration in the United States. I would really recommend people take a look at this. Can you tell us a little bit about the report and what were some of the major findings?
Sure. So Sam and I wanted to look at, two ways of subsidizing families. We could do it with a child allowance, or we could continue with the child tax credit. And of course, there's a lot of issues involved in any of these things. But the bottom line is that we know children living in poverty is bad, not just for children, but for society as well. And the child tax credit, retaining as a full refundable credit with the maximum benefit going to very low income families, is good policy for lifting children out of poverty. It also sort of recognizes that people live their lives in a continuum. We tend to have children when we're young and our salaries are low. So giving a boost at that moment is a critical time to get cash into parents' pockets so they can help their children. We know also that sometimes we see mothers drop out of the labor force when they have infants at home. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But we need to, subsidize that choice if people are going to make it. We know sometimes families need assistance paying for childcare, and the child tax credit can do that. One of the really nice things about either a child allowance or this child tax credit is that it's cash and families can use it in the best way possible. So I might have a childcare problem because I live far away from my family. And I need to hire someone to assist me. Someone who lives next to their mother may have a transportation issue going to work. And so when you deliver cash to people, they're able to use it in the best way to meet their needs. We could never design enough programs to meet every individual need. And so a broad program that allows people to spend flexibly is critical to really making sure no one gets left out.
Okay, I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia.
Hello, and thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I kind of like to piggyback on what you just talked about a little bit about the money that's going directly to families as part of the study that you did. One of the things that has really, that has still kind of stood out to me in this debate was when West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, a man who represents some of the poorest people in America, said that the money that's going directly to families, he had an issue with it going directly to families because they would spend it on drugs and alcohol. Is there any statistic that shows where this money actually goes? Because when as Larry pointed out, Philadelphia is the poorest big city in America. And I don't see a whole lot of people hitting the bars or hitting the clubs or going to their Maserati dealership with this tax credit.
So there's always going to be anecdotes about people spending money in ways we don't want, but there is evidence from other countries that have child benefits. And what we actually saw is when you deliver a cash benefit to families, it allows them to reduce stress levels overall. They're not spending all their time consumed with how am I going to make ends meet? How will I make rent? How will I feed my child? We actually saw a decrease in alcohol and tobacco use among families getting a cash benefit. And we attribute that to having reduced stress in the household. When we look at how tax credits have been spent in the past, we see increased purchases of food. We see people paying off debts. We see people buying bulk goods, sort of a forced savings mechanism. And so the evidence suggests people know what their needs are. They spend their money to meet their needs, and the spending of a child allowance or tax credit is just like other money that comes into their house.
Now, you said that the Clinton administration created the child tax credit back in 1997. What led to that, and why was this problem so long in terms of getting addressed?
So we used to have sort of a two-tiered system. There was a system that provided subsidies for low-income families, usually low-income moms, through the transfer system. And Bill Clinton came and sort of changed all of that. And at the same time, there was a real recognition that middle-income families were struggling. And so he thought, let me implement this child tax credit that will reduce taxes for families with children. The credit was non-refundable, which is a technical term to say it could only be used to offset taxes. Well, very low-income families don't owe federal income taxes in this country. And so that's what made the credit go just to those middle-income families. And then over time, there was recognition that the safety net has really gotten much thinner than it used to be, and families could use assistance. And so the child tax credit was expanded to essentially scoop up more of those families. President Trump actually was involved in doubling the credit as well, from the $1,000 to $2,000. And that's when the credit really started to go to even very high income families. And that was just a function of sort of rearranging other tax benefits. But that's how it went from this small middle class benefit to this larger benefit that covered almost everyone. And then the pandemic hits, and folks who are interested in child poverty realized that this is a tool we could use quite quickly to pick up those very low income families.
Now, a lot of the statistics that you were telling us about, some of the negative outcomes of poverty when it comes to children and the criminal justice system and the educational system and all these different systems, those statistics have been around for a long time. Why do you think that we keep getting, that we tell our government folks, these statistics are still out there and we could, really put a dent in them by doing this one little thing? Why does it seem that it takes so much of an effort to get them to realize that?
That's a really excellent question. There was a report by the National Academies a few years ago, and many leading economists and other folks in child health and doctors got together, and they really documented the harms of child poverty and what it would take to dramatically reduce child poverty. And so the research team has been crystal clear that this is a known need. We need to reduce it. And then there's always going to be questions about what's the best way to do it. And there's sort of one brand of thought that says, we need to make parents work more. That's the way to reduce poverty. And another school of thought that says, if you give people a little bit of support, they'll be able to work more and be more stable. I think the research is somewhat clear that people need a helping hand at some points in their life, and that providing this base amount of income can dramatically help people. Why it takes policymakers so long to move along is simply that it's expensive. It turns out we have a lot of children who are in poverty, and we're going to have to devote some real resources to actually eliminating that. Do I think it's a wise decision in the long term? Absolutely. But the expense comes today, and some of those benefits come much later. And legislators can sometimes be very focused on the cost today rather than the benefits tomorrow. There's some research out there that says, for every dollar you put into a low-income household, you get $7 or $8 in return later with good outcomes for the child. But those, aren't included in the budget scores.
So what can we as media people do to, I guess, better get the word out to the families that might need this tax credit? Because we have one city councilman here that every year he does like 2 or 3 speeches on the council floor talking about the earned income tax credit. He's really, really big on that. But I don't know if everyone knows that this child tax credit in its current form even exists. How can we as media people do a better job in getting that word out?
So media has been extraordinarily important in 2 ways. The first is what you're suggesting, just letting people know that this is a new day. In 2021, even if you had no earnings, if you have no requirement to file a tax return, if you're a family with a child, you will benefit from doing so. And so that outreach is critical. The other thing that's been really important for media is having people tell their own stories. And so we hear, parents talking about what the child tax credit meant. And I think when other people and legislators see what it means for families that, look like yourself. So, my neighbors on TV talking about how important this child tax credit, that might inspire me to go apply for it as well. And so these stories can be really powerful tools to informing of need, but also letting people know about the eligibility side.
Okay. Thank you. Back to Larry McGlynn, and you're still listening to Hall Monitor here on WPPM.
Thanks, Denise. The last thing I'd like to ask you, if we were to make this permanent, what recommendations would you have?
So the most important thing about the 2021 child tax credit is that it is fully refundable. That's what means even very low income families get that maximum benefit. That's my #1 priority if you're concerned about child poverty. The expansions to the young children get a slightly larger benefit than older children. Those are also important. You can think of it as almost all children are in a public setting by age 6, but those 0 to 5s get much less assistance. And so giving a boost in the credit is important for that too. And then third on my list is the higher amounts that were put in place in 2021. We know when we deliver meaningful amounts of credit, people can do important things. If the credit's too small, it's hard to know what impact it will have.
Where can people learn more about your work and find this report and other work you've done?
All of our work is published on the Tax Policy Center website, which is www.taxpolicycenter.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes,
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.